To understand my goals in this video, we need to take a step back to the stream that I did with Usagi, where we first got the microNOVA running. We were able to get the computer powered on, communicating with the terminal, and responding to input, but we were not able to get it to actually do anything. It wasn't from a lack of knowledge on how to use it. The computer's RAM was not writable. We didn't know that for sure at the time and chalked it up to not understanding it. But after a few more days of tinkering, it became apparent to me that there was something wrong with the computer. Now in this video, I'm going to take you through the journey I had to go on to solve this problem. It was far from easy, and I got really lucky in how I could solve it. The following weekend after the collab, I turned my attention to trying to diagnose what was happening with the computer. Because I didn't know when or if I might find or solve this issue, I wasn't recording full quality video yet. There were a lot of simple things I needed to rule out before I could really start doing any proper diagnostics. First, I pulled out all of the RAM cards. After checking for simple things like shorted power rails, I started to test each card one by one in the computer. I'll mention here that the Dasher terminal has a composite video out, which for me is an insanely helpful feature, so I'm capturing the output and overlaying it in the lower right here to make it easier to see. To read a memory address, we send a / after an address location. To set a memory address, we enter a value after an address and hit carriage return or new line. I'm planning on a bigger overview video on how this all works later, but that is the gist of it to test the memory. I put in every RAM card one at a time and tried writing to them, but I never saw a successful change of memory. While I was working through these checks, some of my viewers were looking through the limited available documentation. There were a couple of notable things that were learned. The RAM cards have jumpers for setting their address start location, so my tests were all invalid, except for the lowest address card. We also learned that by default, the RAM should all be filled with ones, not zeros like we're seeing, so it was becoming much more clear that something was not working correctly. We did have one hint of the scope of the problem. One of my async cards was configured with the console debug option, which is how we were able to access the RAM over the terminal. This option has a ROM with code that gets loaded into the RAM address space. We were able to read that code from its location in memory just fine, so memory reading was probably working without any issues. Eventually it was found that the CPU card itself has onboard RAM. The other cards weren't even needed for a minimal boot config, and the CPU card alone has the same issues, meaning the problem is in the CPU card. Or at least, maybe it was. I started probing the backplane of the computer to try and get a sense of what it was doing. We don't, or at least didn't yet, have great information on this, but we had some rough ideas of what it should be doing. These tests weren't too enlightening, but one important thing was found by Usagi, who was still helping me. The backplane has an external bus connection that must be terminated. I already knew about the external bus. When I first picked up the computer, I had to disconnect the drives by unplugging this single small ribbon cable that just goes randomly into the pins of the backplane. This was one of many things I heavily documented before I moved the systems originally, but it turned out inside of the hard disk there was a small terminator board that was needed to make the bus work. The RAM is on the bus, so maybe that was it? No. But thinking about the backplane like this was when I got the idea stuck in my head that it could be that the computer is trying to access the floppy drives and failing. After all, I have a disk labeled boot, and perhaps that is the answer. The only problem was that the drives hadn't been brought up yet and weren't tested. There's a whole video about that process, but to make a long story short, that didn't solve it either. So I went right back to the computer itself to start debugging deeper. I started by looking over the CPU card again, now that it was known it didn't need RAM boards. The CPU board isn't just the main processor, it also has configuration options for how the machine boots, how the RAM is configured, and if it uses any external features. I ended up creating my own jumper setup guide because the available manuals aren't consistent about it through the different revisions. My card should already be configured in a way that works because my machine ran when parked, though there was concern because my unit came with a power fail option installed, which I disabled. But it turned out it was already disabled on the CPU card for some reason. While I was looking it over, I had noticed some slightly suspicious looking solder joints and wanted to get a closer look at them. It was mostly one chip with gold legs that was soldered on very poorly. The solder is breaking away in spots and didn't flow very well when it was put in. In hindsight, this chip seems like it may have been replaced at some point, which makes me think I may have a remanufactured card. There were a couple of other questionable pads, but none as bad as that chip. I reflowed all of its pins to make much better contact than it had before and put it back in the computer. This did nothing, and the memory value still could not be changed. I was feeling stumped. On a whim, I decided to take a look at the CPU card with my thermal camera to see if anything looked off. Bad chips can draw more power and run hotter. And I did see something very helpful, but to my surprise, it was that the RAM was cold. It never warmed up like all of the other chips do in normal operation. I popped in one of the RAM cards and checked it too. The same thing was happening there as well. Instantly, I went to check the power rails because that is a very weird fault, but that wasn't it. All of the voltages were fine. I should take a moment here to mention that in addition to the diagnostics on the computer, I was also working on documenting the components and planning a project roadmap for how I'm bringing the computer up. At this point, I was working on photos of all of the cards in the microNOVA. I had been making aligned front-back photos for easier reference and putting them up on my wiki. You can go check these out yourself if you want. I was focusing a lot of attention on this up front because of the nature of the microNOVA boards. They are filled with custom data general parts, and we didn't have schematics yet. More on that in a bit. One thing we did have, thanks to BitSavers, was a scan of a microNOVA-specific IC manual, so we could figure out some of what was going on. Usagi wanted to investigate a few things based on the newly observed cold RAM symptom, and I was able to give him my PCB reference photos to look at. Before I had ended my last diagnostic session, I had also quickly thrown a scope probe on a couple of signals on the backplane going to the RAM, and we could see that it was at least doing something. One of the next significant signals was chip select. Usagi had a path of signals he was curious to see that went from the CPU to chip select through a couple of data general chips. Now I wanted to work a little bit slower off camera to debug and had formed a plan for how to work on it. I'd also picked up an HP 16500B logic analyzer recently and wanted to get some seat time with it. I'd figured out that I could just barely pull the microNOVA card cage out of the machine to be able to probe it more easily while still having it fully connected. Based on some of the scope measurements before, Usagi had been suspicious that the chip select pin wasn't toggling. Now I set up a probe connected to every signal on the RAM chip to see what it was trying to do, and found that indeed, the chip select signal wasn't activating like it should. On the RAM, this is an input signal for indicating you're trying to access it, so it's generated somewhere else. The next step is to trace it back up the signal path to see where it is being lost. While I was working on processing all of the PCB photos, Usagi had already used them to figure out where it was connected. I set up the logic probes on all of the unique sections to see where the problem was, and we found it. But that's just the good news. The bad news is that it was one of the custom data general chips. Actually, the same type as the MN634 is the one I suspected was replaced before. This was a huge blow, but it wasn't the end of the story because through a massive stroke of luck, I had a spare. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about the fact that it's taken me 5 years to properly get started on the data generals. I didn't get started working on them initially for numerous reasons. These included inexperience with that era of hardware, wanting to learn more about capacitor reforming, the power requirements being massive, fear of needing replacement parts, and a complete lack of documentation and software. I was able to overcome the inexperience, and I've learned radically more about capacitors and reforming since launching CabsWiki. The other concerns were not something I could control though, but several huge things have happened since I got the data generals, and without all of them, I'm not sure I would be able to take the next steps needed to get the hardware going. 1.5 years after I bought the computers, BitSavers scanned and uploaded some microNOVA specific documents that included the technical manual and the IC manual, which have been crucial so far. Now, 3 years after I bought the computers, I was able to buy a couple of microNOVA documents, but they turned out to be unimportant brochures. But around the same time I got those, Bruce Ray of Wild Hair Computer Systems was working to release some data general materials for enthusiasts. He was able to put a large amount of software up on Novas Are Forever, though they were magnetic tape backups, and I don't have a drive for that. Now, I want you to know Bruce is as OG as you could possibly imagine in the data general community. His company Wild Hair Computer Systems provides services and hardware support for these machines now, but also when they were in use originally. He had ads in Byte, so he has a massive trove of resources for these machines, but has also been trying to make sure anything he puts out is legally clear, which means working with the current IP holders of Data General. This brings us to the present. 5 years after I bought the computers, Bruce was finally able to release a motherload of Data General documentation, which I found out about in the middle of this repair. It has completely changed how I can approach the hardware now, but there has still been one last thing holding me back: software. The floppy drives in the microNOVA use a non-standard 8-inch interface, and the disks themselves are hard-sectored. Now, about 2.5 years after I bought the Data Generals, I bought my S100 computers, and those came with very standard 8-inch drives I could work with on other systems. The final hurdle was the hard-sector nature of the disks, and late last year, I started my own potential solution for that by designing an intermediate floppy interface that could strip out the extra index pulses. But around that same time, the software that drives the excellent Greaseweasel project was able to add true hardware sector support. With that, everything was finally in place. We were able to make real progress on the machines. There was real documentation. I have the hardware to interface with at least the microNOVA, and some software that I'm currently using SimH to try and convert from magtape to floppy disks to use on real hardware. If I had tried to get these machines running at any time before essentially now, I would have hit an insurmountable wall. Right now is the only time I could have possibly begun working on the hardware and made real progress. Which brings me back to the immediate problem: a dead Data General chip that I somehow have a spare for. Well, when I bought my couple of Data General brochures, they actually came with a whole spare RAM card for the microNOVA. During my RAM testing, I'd tried it and it shorted out, so I deemed it dead and didn't want to risk putting it back in the system, which meant any chips on it were up for grabs, and it just so happened to have an MN634. My next steps in the repair were to try and replace the MN634 that controls the CS signal. Before I started soldering on the microNOVA CPU, though, I wanted some practice. I was advised by multiple people that Data General PCBs are terrible, and the copper layers very easily lift from the board. So to get a feel for how bad it was before messing up the CPU board, I decided it might be fun to try and find and remove whatever part failed on the spare RAM card. It turned out to be an axial wet tantalum capacitor, one that I actually had a suitable spare for after buying a full set of caps for the dasher. So I tried pulling it off with my usual methods, and yeah, these boards are awful. I did lose a pad on the side that doesn't go anywhere. I was able to put a new cap in place though, and now the RAM board would probably work, but it doesn't matter. I have nothing to use the RAM with if the CPU is bad, and all my other RAM boards actually max out what the microNOVA can handle anyway, so it was still a spare to me, and I started removing one of the MN634s from it. That turned out to be a nightmare. I was trying to go very gentle on it to have more practice for the CPU, and the through holes for the chip legs were barely big enough for the pins to get through, which made it really hard to get all of the old solder to come out. Now, I want to preempt any suggestions on how I could have done this differently by mentioning that after this, I bought some Chip Quick and dip tips for my solder tweezers to do this much easier in the future. For now, what I ended up doing was take a small amount of solder braid, flood it with solder, and then put it up against the side of the chip and use that to heat all of the pins at once on each side to slowly work it out. That finally worked, and I had it free. The next day, I turned my attention to the CPU board, but I didn't want to use that removal method because it felt much rougher on the board than should be needed. But the CPU board design was far worse than the RAM card. There are basically no angular rings on the top sides of the pads, which made the solder flow problem even worse because there was less thermal mass on the top side. So I had to get a little creative for the CPU card. I didn't have a PCB stand, so I mounted a vise on the top side of my electronics bench to hold it from above, and modified my hot air gun handpiece to mount to an arm to hold it from behind. This did work, but it took way longer than needed because I was nervous about turning up the heat too much. Eventually, though, I was able to get the bad chip off of the CPU board. Because we have the IC data sheets, I knew what this chip should do when working. So before I put the new part in, I set up a quick test circuit to verify that the old chip was bad and that the new one was good. I recently picked up a signal generator, so I was able to feed a square wave into it and measure that on a scope to see what it was doing. The MN634 is a bidirectional buffer, so we should be able to enable the output and see the signal pass through. On the original chip, nothing was getting through on the gate that controls the chip select. When I swapped in the new part from the spare RAM board, it worked just as it should. At this point, I was very confident that I had found the problem keeping the machine from working. I soldered a socket into the CPU board so I could swap the chip out later if I could come up with a different replacement to make the RAM card whole again. I was then able to install the new part to see if it worked. I wanted to first measure the RAM on the CPU card by itself to make sure nothing weird was happening. I didn't want to risk any more parts than I needed, and one of my async cards has to be installed to be able to view and change memory. I got my probe clips back on, and when I fired the computer up, I finally saw chip select working for the first time. I quickly put the async card back in, connected the terminal, and when I booted it up, I was greeted with the expected prompt. And now for the moment of truth. Let's do a read. And that, 177777, is exactly what we want to see. That is all ones reporting back from the RAM in octal. Next, I needed to try changing a value, and it's perfect. The microNOVA's CPU is now fully functional. This was such a huge burden lifted for this project, and it could have been so much worse. If I hadn't bought that RAM card, this would have been so much harder to fix. There were still a couple more things I needed to do though, and I'm going to let past Shelby take it over from here.
Hello there. This is the next day after we got the CPU card writing to RAM, and there's a couple of things that I want to do before we wrap this up. First though, let's see if this thing does just straight up boot every time now. That's so awesome. Now, there are two things that I want to do while we're here. First, I want to put in the rest of the cards for this machine to see if they all work as well. Because there's really no reason not to try them. They've all been in there. So I just want to put them all in. That'll also give me a chance to check the clearance of the chip. I'm going to have to take out the other card and remove the probes. And then we're going to see if we can write to all of the memory address ranges that we have available. I don't think there's a good way for me to test the second serial card right now, but we'll just not worry about that for the moment. So let's go ahead and get all of these cards in and see what happens. Now to try and check if we have clearance here, I'm going to put a piece of paper on top of this, and as I slide this in, I'll be able to feel if it's catching on the paper or not. Oh, we're golden. That's not an issue at all. There is tons of space. Even if it hadn't been the gold lid ceramic, it probably would have been fine. All right, let's load it up. All right. That is the machine fully equipped now. So let's see what happens. So I'll have some video capture up here of this closer, but let's just go through this. 1111 read. We'll set this to 1111. 1111 read. Beautiful. That's probably all 32K then. It works perfectly. Oh my gosh. That's all of the hardware. I mean, aside from the second serial port, validated. Oh my gosh. So yeah, it's now totally fine. This is the official Data General service record for my microNOVA here that was for the location that it was used at by its original owner. And I'm incredibly grateful to have this. This is such a cool piece of history. And it means that I have service records for the machines. One of the really cool things about this is that there were blanks of some of the sheets included. So what I've done is recreated them from scratch. This is an all new vector image of the official Data General log sheets here. And I'm now going to add to this and start making my own logs of the repairs that I've done to this machine. Now I have several different log types. I think system incident log here would probably be most appropriate for the RAM repair. So let's go ahead and fill this out. And of course, they always used 2-digit date codes. There we go. I now get to add my own part of the history of this machine to the official logs. And there we are. And with that, if you enjoyed this video, then you may want to subscribe to see the continuing adventures of the Data General microNOVA. If you want to help support the channel, you can find me on Patreon. But for now, that's it, and I will see you next time.
Next time on Tech Tangents.
The very first capacitor I'm measuring here is meant to be 220 microfarads, and I'm only getting 86. It's also, you know, probably not supposed to be 2 ohms of ESR, so that's not looking great.